Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with a video focusing on campaign basics. Um, if you guys enjoy this sort of video, and after then, do feel free to say so, and I might do more sort of these guides. This initial guide is just oriented to run the very basics of the conventional factions in the game. So factions that can occupy a certain type of territory. So basically, vampires, Bretonia Empire, dwarves, greenskins, and of course all their sub-factions. I'm not going to be doing either of the two horde factions, or wood elves, or of course Norska, though Norska still isn't in the game. But I won't be doing those. I won't be doing that. Covering any of those in this video because their mechanics are a bit different, and there are definitely some different considerations you want to make when playing those versus playing the other these more generic factions. So here I've got my Karstein campaign open, and of course there are and I've basically just been covering basics that would affect all factions. I will drop a few tidbits here and there for specific factions, but I definitely want to just go over general stuff, general rules, and go from there. So first and foremost, I think, is the question of expanding and how to build up your cities. Now, from practically speaking, it is basically mandatory that you control entire provinces. You should always prioritize trying to control an entire province, unless it is a unique case. Say you want to take Mount Gunbad and Zufbar as dwarves, and Zufbar occupies Grand Peak, then you might have to settle for it. Just build up some extra public order buildings and make sure you get that gold mine in Gunbad. But in general, you want to control entire provinces. This allows you to drop commandments, and in general, commandments can help you with your public order. In the case of vampire counts, I don't think that's the best option, at least not because it's much better to simply get extra growth in vampiric corruption, because vampiric corruption is what really builds up your control anyway. And it's not real, and your income buildings give you some public order as well, so it's not really a problem for the vampire counts. But for other factions, you'll often want to make use of the public order ability, which varies, of course, from faction to faction. Bretonia's is incredibly potent and will basically allow Bretonia to ignore all corruption, or almost all corruption, and public order events, barring some of the extremes like or if you have a orc incursion, which is -20 for several turns. But barring crazy exceptions like that, it's very simplistic and straightforward. The other thing is, of course, that you want, so definitely try to control entire provinces. The other thing is how to build up your cities. And I would definitely recommend for all factions that you try to tech up to your small settlements first. For some factions, like for example greenskins, because greenskins, especially if you don't have the Grim or the King and the Warlord DLC, greenskins lack much in the way of armor piercing options at low tiers. That can be in a bit of a trouble if they don't level past tier 3. But in general, you do want to not prioritize military buildings too much. They can generally wait until you and stay. You can keep decent military at. You can definitely field the decent military on just tier 3 buildings alone, and instead you should be trying to level up your small settlements up to tier 3. Now you might be wondering, why do you want to level them up to tier 3 and over your main capital settlement? And of course, the capital settlement will bring different benefits, but the main reason why is because you want one, you want income, and you want walls. Walls are absolutely critical. If you don't have walls, you are in big trouble. If there's any sort of revolt, if there's enemy force, and even if it's, say, a half stack of units, it can potentially roll over your city, even if there is a garrison building there. So you definitely want to hit tier 3 as soon as you can and get whatever the tier 3 upgrade fortifications are. Also, once chaos comes around and you have a bunch of heroes roaming around, the reduction to enemy hero success chance is definitely beneficial. And walls ensure that even if there's a stack of, say, hell cannons, dragon ogre shaggoths, and chosen, chaos will still waste 2-3 turns trying to besiege it and building up those siege towers to attack it. And that gives you more than enough time, or it should give you more than enough time, to shift forces to the troubled location and hopefully save your city and avoid losing all that economy or whatever you have there. So definitely something to keep in mind. The Other thing is the other thing is so that yeah, fortifications and income. In general, I would recommend income buildings over anything else. Some factions do struggle a little bit with growth. Dwarves, for example, so you might, or control in the case of orcs. So you might like to throw in, say, make the first small settlement you occupy in a territory, you put in a growth or control building instead. Actually, you can't do that until they're tier 2, so you can't. So it's usually for orcs, it's usually better to just go for income early on. But in general, for most factions, definitely the right setup is going to be an income building and a defensive building in each settlement, and then backed up by a additional building of really your choice. Generally, this will be either a control building, a special building, like say you might have a unique building like say a salt mine or a harbor or whatever, or so let's say here I have the balefire hearth going to spread corruption. And otherwise, if you have a military building that maxes out at tier 3, it is generally good to send those or to put those in your smaller settlements instead of taking up space in your capital. Your capital, each provincial capital should, if possible, really be fielding buildings that go over tier 3, unless there's like a specific unique building chain, or yeah, really unless there's a specific building chain that you want there. So definitely something to keep in mind when you're wondering how you should build up your provinces. Now, how you should expand. Expanding is thinking about your expanding and thinking about where you want to be campaigning with your military is definitely something that needs a lot of consideration, quite a bit of forethought, in my opinion. You want to make sure that the places you're expanding to are places you can control reliably while defending your home base, because until you've taken over a province and built it up a bit so that it's making income, you won't really be able to build up additional armies to defend it. So generally, for example, with vampire counts, it's fairly straightforward. You simply expand out to take first Eastern, then Western Sylvania, and then generally it's smart to simply expand northward, because Kislev doesn't have any friends, Ostermark isn't too popular either, and this way you're avoiding getting into too much conflict with the Empire. At least early on, because the Empire factions do tend to like each other quite a bit, especially when it comes to beating up on vampire counts, so that's something you definitely want to be wary of. Then so that's something, yeah, definitely. When you're expanding, you want to make sure that it's a place you can maintain control over, that it's not going to be an overextension. It's much harder to overextend than, say, vampires, because they really rely on their corruption build up to increase their control of an area. But even for other factions, you don't want to, like, even if you can theoretically keep campaigning onward after you captured a province, you generally want to sit tight for a little bit, make sure to build up buildings, make sure to build up some defenses, perhaps drop some heroes there to build up growth and that sort of thing. The other issue is, of course, campaigning. And now, generally, you will want to. Now, of course, some factions can only control certain types of territory, with the exception of the Wood Elves and Norse and Norska. Kind of, from what I've gathered so far, Norska will be able to control major faction capitals, and port cities. Wood Elves can control every sort of city, but it does become a tier 1 outpost, which is very weak. And like I said, I'm not really going to be going too much depth on those. But for all the other factions, Bretonia, Empire, and Vampires, and all their sub-factions can only control human/vampire settlements, and dwarves, orcs, dwarves and orcs can only control dwarvish and orcish settlements. So generally, you might definitely be enticed to go only campaign in territories that you can control, because it gives you it can give you much more immediate benefits. But don't ever underestimate the potential of raising or settlement or destroying, sacking, that sort of thing, settlements that you can't necessarily control. For example, if your vampire counts, raising Zufbar to your south can be incredibly useful. Creating a dead zone here means that the dwarves can't really push into you too effectively. You can spread vampiric corruption here, kind of create a no-go dead zone over in Karak Kadrin, Karak Angor, and just deny your opponent this potential sources of income and a potential base to threaten you from. Similarly, with Empire, destroying Skarsnik in Karak Azgraz with the Crooked Moon can give you potential for Karak Norn to expand there, and you can eventually trade with them. So these are definitely considerations you want to be making when you're deciding to campaign where you want to be campaigning towards. just because you can't control a territory doesn't necessarily mean it's the wrong choice to go attack it. Then, of course, there are unique buildings, and sometimes you might want to prioritize campaigning in a certain direction just because of those buildings. For example, there is the Boca Palace in Kislev. The port of Arengrad does have a tier 5 variant that makes a lot of money. So does Marienburg. So definitely be on the lookout for those sorts of structures. Castle Tempelhof, for example, does have the Dark Lair. I didn't build it here, but Castle Drakenhof, when you're playing as the Karsteins, has a pretty cool structure. The Mausoleum of the Mad Count, which is a huge boost to your vampire capacity and production and all that. So definitely keep a lookout for these sorts of buildings. Things like gold mines, definitely useful to keep track of. I'm not going to go over all of those here, but I'm sure there are guides where you could look those up, and definitely good to keep track of them. Now, another thing, and I forgot to mention with the fortifications, is that it is generally good to build up fortifications, especially as you move away from your capital city. It is generally good to start building up fortifications in your provincial capitals, because they can make it much easier to defend against enemy counterattacks or enemy offensives against you. So definitely something to keep a lookout for. So those are definitely, I think those are basically the campaign basics. You want to make sure you're expanding and that you're able to defend both your home base and where you're expanding. You want to make sure you have a very powerful economy. You want to make sure you have fortifications everywhere. Economy really dominates this game. Do not over invest in it. Sounds bad, but you don't necessarily want to overinvest in your military quality. As you can see, I have like a really high quality military here, but as you can see, some of these forces are pretty cheap, Depot, and a lot of these the good forces are simply raise the dead areas. So generally, most factions, with the exception of orcs, in my opinion, can very reliably get by on just their tier 2 and 3 unit selection. For most of the game, in some cases for all of the game. So, especially dwarves, I've done dwarf campaigns with only tier 1 and 2 units. So it's definitely doable for some factions. So definitely be aware of that. Just because you don't get caught up in shiny, ooh, this looks like a nice, this is an expensive unit, so it must be amazing syndrome. Definitely try. Remember that cheap units can still be effective, and when you need multiple armies to defend a lot of territory, it can often be good to simply build armies that are generally a bit weaker and then stiffened up by a few higher tier units. Like here you can see a Graveguard that I probably raised dead, a bunch of Skeleton Warriors, some Blood Knights, some Black Knights, and a Terrorgeist backing up a bunch of skeletons. So that's I think that's like kind of just gives you an idea of how you can make things a little cheaper. Of course, this is going to vary a little bit faction by faction. If you're playing as Bretonnia, I would never suggest building up the defensive. I would never suggest building up the defensive structures because Bretonnia gets walls for free once it hits tier 3. Similarly, for Bretonnia, I would not recommend control and growth buildings because Bretonnia's growth and control are very good simply because of that. One, their commandments are amazing, and two, while they don't get income from their settlements, they get massive amounts of growth from their settlements. So that is those are sort of the little faction differences. With vampire counts, you always want to invest in corruption buildings because the more corruption always improves towards a certain point. Keep in mind that it's not like an additive or subtractive thing with corruption. It's not that like 3 corruption cancels out 3 anti-corruption. It averages out 3 and 3 will average out towards a 50% mark. Here you can see 13, 22, and 2. It's moving towards the 86% mark for corruption, and it's not going to go past that. So and almost all places have a untainted populace. Which will be undoing a bit of your corruption. So those are definitely, or in some cases, if the enemy's moving characters through that sort of thing, they'll be undoing your corruption. So those are definitely things you want to keep track of, be aware of. These sorts of mechanics that could potentially prove troublesome to deal with. So with vampires, you want to be building up corruption. With Empire is probably the most well-rounded. Empire doesn't really have to focus on anything in particular. So basically just build up whatever's utility. And for dwarves, growth is a problem. For orcs, control is a problem. So you should invest in buildings that will improve that. For vampires, because your control is based on your corruption, once again, you want to be investing in corruption. Finally, the last thing I want to go over in this short little intro to campaign and like breakdown of tactics and strategy for campaign is to make sure you make use of heroes. Most factions have access to a hero or some sort of hero fairly early on into the game. Most should have access by tier 3. For example, if we look at well, this is a small settlement, so let's say Castle Templehof. If we look at vampire counts, you can get your Banshee by tier 3. You can get White King at tier 4. Vampires are both at tier 4 and Necromancer at tier 4. So you can get a lot of heroes very quick, a lot of different heroes very early on. If you get the Mausoleum of the Mad Count, you can actually get vampires at tier 1 for Karstein. So these are things that you definitely want to keep track of. Heroes can be a huge boon. A lot of heroes can improve your growth, which means that you won't have to invest in growth buildings, especially if you invest in their talents. Some heroes can improve your control. For example, Whites, Thanes, Empire Captains, Paladins, these sorts of heroes. I do believe Paladins have that trait. They will improve your local control. And they can also provide debuffs against your opponent. They can hold them back. They can reduce their growth. They can reduce their control, that sort of thing. So those are definitely things to watch out for. Never underestimate the power of heroes. Yes, they are somewhat expensive, but those buffs can be huge. And if you can field at least a few of them, they can be incredibly potent. Some factions are definitely better kitted out to field them than others. Vampire counts in particular are very hero-oriented. And of course, all heroes can launch assassinations, which means you can, once you deal, and especially some heroes that are assassination dedicated, can be taking down enemy heroes, making sure they're not causing you any being a nuisance in your backline. This is especially a problem during Chaos Invasion when the Chaos Warriors have a whole bunch of Chaos Sorcerers and Exalted Champion or Exalted Heroes roaming around your backline, causing trouble. So definitely don't underestimate the power of heroes. Definitely try to look at each one and see what they can do. With Lords, I would actually this is something I should go over here as well. Lords, when you're picking your Lords, I would generally recommend Combat Lords. Mage Lords, with exception and with Vampire counts, where all their Lords have magic, I would recommend Vampires because Vampires are the best in combat of the Lords that you have an option to field. So you can always field a hero who does magic. Every faction has its own selection of magic heroes, but with the exception of legendary lords, I would not recommend really running a lord who's not a competent combatant. In the case of Bretonia, I would never really run the spellcasters, the lady, or whatever, I do believe it's called lady or something like that. Lord type. I would never really recommend running a goblin shaman for orcs. Not a sorcerer for chaos, that sort of thing. Definitely wouldn't recommend any of those unless they're a legendary lord. And of course, some of those hybrid support heroes, like for example, priests for the archlectors for empire or rune lords for dwarves can be fairly competent. So I wouldn't necessarily dissuade you from those, but definitely I wouldn't recommend running spellcaster lords. So definitely for vampires, I would never recommend running necromancers, Strigoi Ghoul Kings. I wouldn't really recommend. Even though Strigoi Ghoul Kings are like that weird support type of hero, I still wouldn't recommend them because vampires are just that strong. So definitely, those are a few things I'd recommend keeping in mind. Economy is important. Fortifications are important. Look out for what your faction's unique benefits and problems are to try to overcome those. Make sure not to overextend. Overextension can lead to disastrous consequences. Don't forget about your heroes. Don't make your armies overly expensive. You want to be able to field a lot. Quantity does have a quality all of its own in this game. Being able to field a lot of armies is great. As you can see here, fielding quite a few armies on the field. Of course, not all of these are maxed out, but definitely able to field quite a few. So that is something. And of course, this is almost a maxed out army. It's important to keep in mind. That's all flying units basically. But definitely some things to keep in track of. I'll also one more thing with legendary lords. Don't necessarily stress too much about getting the achievements done to get legendary lords. Legendary lords are good. Most of them are very good. Some of them are not good, and there's a handful like Gorst who I wouldn't really bother with. But most legendary lords are good, but don't necessarily stress about completing their quests to unlock them. You can definitely get by without them. Generic lords usually have fairly comparable skill sets and traits. And talents and all that, so that it shouldn't be too much of a hassle or a disadvantage to not get them. So definitely, I hope these tips and tricks help any of you who are struggling with campaign or new to the game or trying to learn the ins and outs of Total War Warhammer campaign. If you like this video, do leave a like and subscribe down below, or leave any comments and criticism if you enjoy this video, and if you think this was a good video, if you would like me to see me do more guides on other aspects of campaign, like defeating chaos or faction specifics or horde campaign mechanics, that sort of thing. Um, Definitely feel free to comment those in the comment section. I'll be sure to read them and respond as soon as I can. I appreciate you all for watching, and Wyvern out.